For just 50 cents, I can get from Varsity Lakes here in the Gold Coast to Gympie North, here in the middle of nowhere. I have just travelled over 260 kilometres for only 50 cents, a trip that would have cost me $31.10 before 50-cent fares were implemented, or $47 if I were to drive, making this train trip I took literally 100 times cheaper than driving. But why are 50-cent fares here? What actually are they? And apart from the cherry-picked example I just said above, are they actually good policy or just a vote grab implemented conveniently before an election? It's early 2024. The Queensland state election is set to happen later that year, with cost of living being one of the main issues on voters' minds. So, on the 26th of May, the incumbent Premier of Queensland, Stephen Miles, announces 50-cent fares.
I announce 50-cent fares.
The pitch was simple. The cost of a one-way ticket on any TransLink bus, train, tram, or ferry would be brought down to just 50 cents. Didn't matter where you lived or how far you travelled. A trip from my place to your local cinema via the 680, 50 cents. Rosewood to Caboolture, 50 cents. From the airport to the city centre, you guessed it, $10.95. The only exception to this deal was the airport line, which was privately owned unlike the rest of the network. So, a half-price deal was negotiated to bring the price down from $21.90 down to just $10.95. But you get the point. It was 50 cents for almost all trips. The goal of the fare reduction was to save people money, obviously, but it also had the secondary objective of boosting patronage, which never really recovered after COVID, and by extension was intended to reduce traffic around the city. The initial trial was set to last 6 months, after which the government would evaluate whether to make the scheme permanent or scrap it based on its performance. On the 11th of June, the state budget was officially revealed, in which $150 million was set aside for the trial. Finally, on the 5th of August 2024, 50-cent fares officially began. The 50-cent fare enjoyed the general backing of the LNP, who supported Labor's cost of living relief, but accused them of implementing it as a vote grab before an upcoming election, a claim that we will get to later as it has some credibility behind it. Just over a month before the state election, both major parties doubled down on their support for 50-cent fares when they both committed to making the fare reduction permanent. Oh, and what's that? It looks like it's the 26th of October, time for the 2024 Queensland state election. Unfortunately for Miles, Labor got absolutely steamrolled, losing 15 seats and changing the composition of Parliament from this to this. David Crisafulli of the LNP becomes the 41st Premier of Queensland, and a bit over a month later, on the 30th of November, the LNP announces that 50-cent fares would become permanent at the end of the trial.
I announce permanent 50-cent fares.
Fast forward to February 19th, 2025, and the now leader of the opposition, Stephen Miles, proposes the 50-cent forever bill in Parliament. Basically, if this bill were to be passed into law, this would make 50-cent fares the law in Queensland. That sounds too good to be true, and clearly it was, because it was later ejected out of Parliament on a technicality. That didn't really matter, however. In fact, the bill itself was really quite unnecessary, as the LNP had already committed $1.5 billion to keep 50-cent fares in place for the next 5 years, with $384 million being set aside in the 2025-26 budget alone. Furthermore, the 50-cent fares were simply too popular to remove, to the point where the LNP was fighting to take credit for the policy entirely, through various means, and people started referring to Stephen Miles as the 50-cent fare guy. So essentially, pulling this policy would put you into political purgatory. That's the when and the why. Now let's cover the how. How have 50-cent fares actually helped? And are they an effective policy, or just put in to boost Labor's dwindling popularity before the 2024 state election? In other words, was it really worth it? The 50-cent fare initiative had the main objective of easing the cost of living crisis, followed by the secondary objectives of boosting patronage to pre-COVID numbers and reducing the amount of traffic on the roads. So let's start with cost of living. Before the fare reduction, Brisbane had crazy expensive fares. In fact, our fares were the most expensive in the country for most categories. After the fare reduction, however, we became the cheapest fares in the country, and by an order of magnitude. In short, our transport network used to be awful and expensive, and now you just get what you pay for. While the 6-month trial was expected to save $150 million, it beat expectations by saving $181 million for commuters instead. And to date, the government has subsidised over $466 million worth of fares. But do the benefits outweigh the costs? I mean, the government could invest into government-subsidised ice cream stores if they really wanted to, but that wouldn't be very beneficial to the public, and that money could go elsewhere for a higher level of economic return. And the answer to that question is no. The benefits don't outweigh the costs. According to one consultancy firm, the cost-benefit ratio for 50-cent fares is 0.18. That means for every dollar that the state government spends on the scheme, it gets 18 cents back in economic value. This economic value comes from stuff like less road congestion and less car accidents from people choosing public transport over driving and so on. So, the cost-benefit ratio of the scheme is terrible, but so what, you might say? This is a cost of living relief measure. It should just help Queenslanders in the moment during this cost of living crisis. And that is true. A program can be successful even if the cost-benefit ratio is below 1 if its objective is to help with the cost of living in the moment, for example. But 50-cent fares fall through here as well. The problem is that the fare concession goes to everyone, not just people who actually need it. For an example, a fare reduction will not matter as much to a wealthy individual who is not significantly affected by cost of living pressures, but it can make a significant difference for a lower income individual who now has more money for other expenses. They may now be able to travel further and access better job opportunities with that additional mobility, boosting their productivity, helping them contribute more to the economy, and ultimately generating returns that offset the cost of the fare subsidy in the first place. In their paper on public transport pricing, the Australian Productivity Commission found that, quote, there is a scope for better targeting of concessions, and that state and territory governments should review public transport concession eligibility criteria to better target concessions to those who need them. Yet the 50-cent fare scheme does the opposite. Instead of focusing support on those who rely on public transport, it gives everyone a concession, including people who gain almost no meaningful benefit from it at all, in direct contradiction to the Commission's findings. On an inquiry into public transport, a Victorian parliamentary committee reached a similar conclusion, stating that, quote, the majority of evidence suggests that if the Victorian government wishes to assist people facing cost of living pressure, it should target those on a low income, not whole groups. When considering the application of across-the-board concessions to certain groups, regardless of income, the committee has reservations that some of the public funds would go to wealthy individuals who are less in need of government support. The writing is on the wall. Broad, all-purpose concessions just don't work. This brings me on to my next point, the price of the scheme. Although 50-cent fares appear inexpensive, the policy requires the Queensland government to replace hundreds of millions of dollars annually in lost revenue, money that could instead be allocated to high-impact priorities. Around $300 to $400 million per year could fund the one-off cost of duplicating the Cleveland line, which would allow train frequencies to increase at least twice over in peak, fixing a huge bottleneck in the line, or to double off-peak rail frequency from 30 to 15 minutes network-wide, or even working with the council to introduce over 50 high-frequency buses, which would improve accessibility in ways that generate much higher and, more importantly, sustained patronage growth over time. The real cost of 50-cent fares is therefore not a material loss, rather it's the opportunity of costs of not making better investments. Another casualty of the 50-cent fare scheme is the axing of distance-based pricing. Before 50-cent fares, the further you travelled, the more you got charged, which is logical, but now it's gone. Using the extreme example from the start of the video, the trip from Gympie North to Vasti Lakes costs just 50 cents instead of $31.10 with an adult paper ticket. That's a 98.5% decrease in price. With such a level of price reduction, the patronage increase associated with the fare decrease would never justify the decrease in the first place. That's not to say that fare reductions are inherently wrong, but distance-based pricing plays an important role in efficiently allocating costs and supporting fare recovery. This no doubt helps the pitifully low cost-benefit ratio of the scheme. But what about patronage? In short, it was off the charts. In the first week alone, overall trips surged 11.6% compared to the same week the previous year. Ridership numbers rose substantially to 98.5% of pre-COVID levels, up from 87% before the trial. The Saturday and Sunday of the first week were the busiest weekend days in the network's history, recording increases of 17.4% and 15.9% respectively from pre-COVID numbers. On that Saturday, ferries shattered records with a 47.4% patronage increase. Patronage wasn't just up. In every mode and by every metric, it skyrocketed. And this momentum didn't just diminish after the initial hype. The data showed that the patronage continued to stay strong across all modes after the trial ended when compared to the same 6-month period in the year before. In fact, overall usage sat at 105% of pre-COVID levels. Very curiously, some of the steepest increases in public transport ridership occurred outside of metropolitan Brisbane, notably in the Gympie LGA and in Townsville, which both recorded an insane 49% jump in public transport uptake, far above the 18.3% average across the entire state. However, crucial bits of context are left out, exaggerating the effects of the patronage increase. This is a graph that shows public transport patronage in southeast Queensland from mid-2012 to mid-2025. Once COVID hit, patronage massively decreased, which is why patronage plummets here, and after that it has been steadily recovering ever since. So, now let's only focus on the post-COVID patronage. Can you guess when 50-cent fares were introduced? Here? Perhaps even there? Well, it was actually right here, which was followed by a statistically insignificant rise in patronage. So why is there no visible change in patronage trend after 50-cent fares were introduced? It just looks the same as before. The answer is quite simple. The reported 18.3% value is an increase in overall patronage in the 6-month period following the introduction of the scheme, not an increase in overall patronage due to the scheme over that period. Correlation does not necessarily imply causation, meaning that while some of the 18.3% increase came from the 50-cent fares, a lot of it probably didn't. To illustrate my point, it's useful to compare patronage increases from previous years. The 18.3% increase we're all familiar with was in the half-year period between August 4th, 2024 to February 2nd, 2025. For reference, the two previous periods had increases of 11.81% and 36.8% respectively, and a 5.06% decrease before that. As you can see, the statistics vary wildly, and the 2022 to 23 period even outpaces the 18.3% increase twofold without 50-cent fares. While I don't doubt that 50-cent fare scheme helped the 18.3% growth figure, it is likely that a lot of the growth is attributed to patronage recovery from the COVID pandemic. And this is supported by the literature, which suggests that the relationship between a fare reduction and a ridership increase is largely inelastic, meaning that a large decrease in fare pricing will incur a small increase in patronage. The reason for this is quite simple. Price is not an entry barrier, as public transport is already dirt cheap. The fact of the matter is that before 50-cent fares, the average weekly adult fare was 3.4% of the average wage. That's just not a lot. Just as a little thought experiment, consider how much it costs to own a car versus use public transport to get around everywhere. $5,000? Well, that's just for fuel. Don't forget insurance. $8,000 maybe? What about service? $15,000. It costs the average Australian $15,000 per year to own a car in Australia. And that doesn't even include the cost of loan repayments if you've financed a new car. If we consider those, then you will be set back $24,000 per year just to own a car. Compare that to the cost of public transport before 50-cent fares, at only $3,000 per year, and almost $600 per year after 50-cent fares. Sure, $600 is a lot less than $3,000, but $3,000 is already a fraction of the cost it takes to own a car, making the fare reduction pretty meaningless, as the alternatives are so much more expensive anyway. There is also the issue of peak hour pricing. Before 50-cent fares, your ticket would cost just a little bit more if you commuted during peak hours. That was vital, as it incentivized people to shift their commute either slightly before or after peak, and acted as a deterrent to overcrowding. Overcrowding is a big problem. Providing extra peak capacity is expensive and often impossible without major capital upgrades due to network bottlenecks. The cost of overcrowding on patronage also massively outweighs the minor inconvenience of a peak hour surcharge. The discomfort and delay caused by standing, especially in overcrowded conditions, imposes real, measurable costs on passengers. According to the Australian Transport Assessment and Planning Guidelines, it is estimated that the cost of standing during a normal trip feels like 1.65 times the in-vehicle cost, and standing during an overcrowded trip feels like 2.1 times the in-vehicle time cost. In practical terms, this means that the non-financial burden of just 20 minutes of standing can nearly double the fare itself. You might think that the peak hour surcharge would have the effect of decreasing overall patronage, but that's just not true. See, when all roads leading into the city become one huge glorified parking lot during morning peak hour, people are willing to pay the extra cost to ride public transport, making peak hour demand for it largely inelastic to cost. This means there's no reason to not implement peak hour pricing, as everyone wins. The state government gets a healthy amount of fare revenue, costs are saved by not having to launch extra peak hour services, and the commuter gets less crowding. Speaking of Brisbane roads, let's talk about traffic. While initially traffic volumes fell a teeny amount, in the month following the fare reduction, it rebounded back on motorways, while arterial road traffic kept decreasing. However, these traffic decreases were insignificant. According to the TMR, most traffic decreases were within the normal range of variance, with roads within the BCC being the only ones seeing a decrease in traffic below the expected range. In the September quarter, Transurban, that's the company that operates all of Brisbane's toll roads, reported a 1.3% increase in traffic on their roads, essentially nullifying the little progress that 50-cent fares had achieved to alleviate congestion. This begs the question, if patronage has risen, why have traffic volumes stayed the same? Well, In 2020, the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal of New South Wales, IPART for short, released a report investigating the effects of free public transport on the state's transit system. As a side note, while 50-cent fares are not the same as free fares, both use a flat rate. 50-cent fares can then be seen as a less extreme version of free fares, so the report's findings still apply. The findings indicated that there would be an immediate increase in public transport ridership of around 40%, but the reduction in road congestion would be around 2 to 5%, and there are three main reasons for this. Mainly, car use is far greater than public transportation use, so even a large increase in public transport uptake will have much smaller impacts on motor vehicle use. In Brisbane, around 85.5% of daily trips are made by car. Now, assuming the 18.3% increase in public transport patronage only cut straight out of the mode share of car trips, which it didn't, then you will find that car mode share only decreased by 1.2 percentage points. Second, leisure trips, such as city cat rides taken for enjoyment, rise sharply. This is reflected in the ferry's almost 50% surge in ridership, as well as huge increases in trips made on weekends. Finally, super cheap fares attract people who would have otherwise cycled or walked short distances. When public transport was made free in the Estonian capital of Tallinn back in 2013, trips made by walking dropped by a staggering 40%. Ironically, this actually undermines one of public transportation's biggest benefits, its contribution to the public's health. This means that this type of parasitic patronage is quite literally harmful for people's health, but also financially, as the government is subsidising trips that are not lowering cost of living or reducing traffic, but only serve to boost patronage numbers on paper.
So, was it really worth it? Despite its immense cost and overwhelming popularity with the public, the 50-cent fare initiative fell well short of what could have been achieved with such a substantial investment. The primary goal of cost of living was only partially met, and poorly, as subsidies were entirely untargeted. The flat 50-cent rate also abolished peak period and distance-based pricing, with all three changes running counter to the recommendations of the Productivity Commission.
While public transport patronage did increase by 18.3% overall, this number is likely overstated, and the overall ridership increase could have been far greater had the foregone revenue from these design decisions been redirected into service improvements and infrastructure upgrades. And did the 50-cent fare initiative really decrease traffic? Well, unless you count confirmation bias-drenched anecdotal evidence from Reddit as fact, the figures point to the fact that nothing has changed. This outcome is disappointing, especially given the large body of research cautioning against the very measures introduced by 50-cent fares. This includes the Australian Productivity Commission's report on fare pricing, which has been heavily referenced throughout this episode. Their recommendations were largely ignored. IPART's investigation into free, and by extension near free flat fares, concludes that such fare structures are a poor policy choice. International case studies examining the pitfalls of similar schemes and even examples from within our own city show far more cost-effective ways of boosting patronage and reducing congestion, such as the very successful Buzz program. You have to have been blind to just miss all this evidence before implementing the 50-cent fare scheme. And to add insult to injury, the Labor government ignored the Public Transportation Fare Advisory's panel recommendation to scrap 50-cent fares in favour of more sensible and cost-effective reforms to the fare structure. This is the same expert panel established by the Palaszczuk Labor government itself, whose explicit purpose was to provide independent, evidence-based advice on public transport fares.
But if the scheme was so flawed, with a large unavoidable pool of evidence warning against it, then why was it implemented the way it was? And were there any ulterior motives? There is one aspect in which 50-cent fares excelled at spectacularly: popularity. As mentioned previously, the scheme enjoys the strong backing of the public, with 92% of people approving of the policy, and even bipartisan support in Parliament. Stephen Miles is commonly referred to as the 50-cent fare guy, and the LNP often fight to claim credit for the project as their own. Public perception around transport has also shifted significantly, with 53% of people reporting an improvement in their public transport service. And it was even reported that people felt safer on public transport for some reason.
So, given this information, is it possible that the policy was deliberately implemented as a way to boost the party's popularity before the election? Labor has a few questions it needs to answer, so let's hear it straight from the horse's mouth.
Did your government help cover up the massive ice wall that surrounds our flat Earth when Labor was in power?
We'd be.
It's a simple question, Steve.
That's just not true.
Okay. Moving on now. If elected in 2028, will you ban cloud so that every day is legally classified as sunny for tourism brochures? Right, I think that concludes our interview for today.
Seriously though, we did actually send some questions out to Bart Mellish, the State Transport Minister, about the implementation of 50-cent fares. Mainly, why were the concessions not targeted contrary to the Productivity Commission's reports? And secondly, why did the government ignore the Public Transport Fares Advisory Panel that suggested against 50-cent fares? On the first point, Mellish said that the scheme was designed as cost of living relief, a way to boost public transport use and reduce congestion. The universal fares were chosen to avoid the complexity of multiple eligibility tests and categories. This is a disappointing answer. First, the evidence shows that 50-cent fares do little to reduce congestion and are an ineffective long-term patronage strategy. Secondly, while making the fare structure simpler is a positive, it doesn't justify spending $300 million a year when targeted concession cards already existed in the form of the Green Go card. Mellish also failed to explain why the Productivity Commission's advice was ignored. To the second point, Mr. Mellish said that the government simply overrode the suggestions of the panel because in the eyes of the Miles government, the benefits outweighed the risks, when they clearly didn't. Those are some pretty lackluster answers. So either the government was blind in the face of facts, or there are some other factors at play here.
The 50-cent fare trial was introduced in August of 2024, and the election was held in October the same year. So some people have suggested that this timing is not a coincidence.
See, leading into the 2024 state election, the odds were stacked against Labour. Every single poll since May of last year predicted a two-party preferred LNP win, so it's not hard to see that Labour needed a quick popular policy to boost the polls. Polling actually did steadily improve for Labour after the introduction of 50-cent fares,
But correlation does not necessarily imply causation, so we can't exactly jump to conclusions here.
On a less conspiratorial note, there is another explanation. The decision to extend the concessions to everyone was done to promote social equality, a long-term agenda goal for the Labour Party. Why do only some people get a concession and not everyone? That's just not fair. This might seem a little silly at first, but there are many examples of the Labour Party doing this in the past. This was the logic behind the 2024 federal Labour tax cuts and the Miles government's energy rebates, both of which aided wealthy households alongside struggling ones. This pretty much suggests that the 50-cent fare policy is an ideological choice rather than one dictated solely by evidence-based targeting.
But those are just theories, unsubstantiated political theories whose truths will never actually be known. For all we know, it could be a combination of the above reasons or a completely different reason whatsoever. So, let's not dwell on this mess. Instead, let's ask ourselves a more important question. How do we fix this? So, how would I do it? Let's say I was given an annual budget of $350 million. God forbid, and tasked with implementing a scheme that somewhat resembled 50-cent fares that would help with cost of living, would improve patronage, and reduce traffic. How would I do it?
First, I would give the Independent Public Transport Fares Advisory Panel clear legal authority to prevent situations like this from happening again, instead of keeping it as a purely advisory panel. While the Transport Minister would retain final say on fare levels, their decisions would be constrained by limits set by the panel. This mirrors the system in use in New South Wales, where IPART determines the maximum increase in public transport fares each year, and the Minister can choose a lower fare if needed. We should implement a similar approach here. Secondly, I would bring back distance and peak hour pricing with the usage of 8 zones. Then a fare cap will be implemented. The more you use the network, the less you should pay per trip, so a $50 weekly cap will be introduced, similar to the caps in Sydney and Melbourne. This would have the immediate effect of lowering the average weekly public transport cost from $59.67 to something around $46 as a conservative estimate. A daily cap will also be introduced, where travel will be free after the first 2 trips, an actual recommendation by the Fare Advisory Panel. 85% of adult and 91% of concession trips are made between 2 zones or less, and introducing this cap will not only be relatively cheap, but will target individuals who are especially reliant on public transport. Well, that's great, but how much will it actually cost? Well, assuming a linear relationship between the average weekly public transport costs and government subsidy levels, we can interpolate between the pre-50-cent fares and the 50-cent fare period to estimate the cost of the new weekly cap. This yields an annual cost of approximately $117 million. How about free travel after 2 trips? Well, this incentive already existed for seniors prior to the introduction of 50-cent fares, and the cost was around $1.1 million annually. If seniors account for roughly 5% of total patronage, extending this benefit to all users would cost approximately $20.9 million per year. In total, these measures would cost approximately $138 million annually, and at first glance this may appear underwhelming. Average weekly costs fall by about 1/3 of the reduction reduction achieved under 50-cent fares at roughly 1/3 of the cost. The crucial difference, however, is who benefits. This model delivers the largest savings to those who spend the most on public transport, unlike 50-cent fares did. Now we have to tackle the problem of concessions, and only if we had a way of doing this. Maybe some sort of go-card that would charge concession fares to people who needed them most. And, oh look, I've got an idea, we could call it a concession card. But no, that'd be too expensive and hard to implement. Oh wait, we already had a card that did exactly that. The green go-card halved fares for users and did exactly what 50-cent fares failed to do, provide targeted relief to people who are actually in need of the cheaper fares. This concession system can be further improved by refining eligibility criteria and expanding access, ensuring no one is left out, or maybe introducing new go-cards aimed at a subset of the disadvantaged populace for even better targeting. But the point is this, the concession system we had in place before 50-cent fares worked just a lot better. That is cost of living. Now it's time for the patronage increase. This is where the fun begins. While some funds should be allocated to help ease cost of living and improve concessions, most should be spent on service and infrastructure upgrades which will attract meaningful patronage. Building things gets you your money's worth. For an example, Crossroad Rail has a cost-benefit ratio of 1.41. The introduction of ETS signalling has a cost-benefit ratio of 2.9. It's 2.4 for Brisbane Metro, and the list goes on. Service frequency improvements are also a major driver of patronage, as mentioned previously. Doubling service during off-peak hours on a popular train line, especially on weekends, can easily more than double patronage. When combined with targeted upgrades and the expansion of high-frequency bus services, these measures drive not only short-term increases in ridership, but also sustained long-term growth in public transport use. As an example, consider investing in Buzz high-frequency services that run around the city. There are currently 17 of them out of the more than 230 bus routes operated by the Brisbane City Council. While they make up around 7.5% of the council's bus routes, they carry 45% of the council's total bus patronage. That's 36.8 million annual passengers for just a handful of routes. And for an extra $350 million a year, that can get you an extra 50 of these routes. If the objective is patronage growth, the evidence is clear. People respond to frequency and coverage, not just fare cuts, which is achieved through construction of infrastructure and service improvements. And this brings me to traffic. How do we reduce it? By far, the most effective way of deterring traffic would be to utilize congestion pricing, basically charging drivers money if they drive on a clogged up road. It is the golden standard in congestion reduction. The problem, however, is the fact that the policy is obviously hideously unpopular, and any government that implements it will be sure to spend their next term in opposition. So, for all intents and purposes, our best bet to reduce traffic would be through sustained investments in public transport infrastructure and service upgrades, gradually shifting commuting patterns and slowly increasing public transport uptake. This is slow, but it is guaranteed to translate into strong long-term patronage growth, in contrast to fare cuts, which might provide short-term relief, but do nothing in the long term. So, are 50-cent fares a success? Well, it depends. From a political standpoint, it couldn't get any better. Bipartisan support in Parliament, overwhelmingly universal support from the general public, and enthusiastic backing from businesses. It's very rare to see Queensland so united on something, let alone public transport fares. And precisely because of this, 50-cent fares are here to stay permanently. It's truly baffling.
But from a pragmatic lens, it could not get more grim. It's a money thing that delivers a modest, short-term bump in patronage while making no structural improvements to the system to sustain long-term growth. It trades lasting reform for instant popularity, a feel-good strategy that sounds great on paper and in headlines, but quietly undermines better evidence-based solutions. A poor populist policy is what it is. And with that said, I hope you learned something new today. And as always, thanks for watching.